When it comes to gaming in 2023, I try and have realistic expectations. Take Baldur's Gate 3 for instance. I expected it to be good, but it absolutely exceeded my expectations. I was blown away. But sometimes there'll be a game that you expect to be bad, and it turns out that you weren't pessimistic enough. That is the case with Knights of the Old Republic Remake, and it looks like by all accounts, it has been cancelled. I'm going to call this game KOTOR for the rest of the video, because I'm not paid by the word. I really like the original KOTOR game. Star Wars is one of those IPs that has absolutely been butchered in the movie theaters, but it's actually had a pretty good run in the video game medium. LucasArts, they made a ton of excellent games. They had the Jedi Knight series, TIE Fighter, and when BioWare, the studio behind the original Baldur's Gate games, got a hold of the IP, they actually did pretty well with it. KOTOR is not a complex game. It was designed to be more accessible than your usual CRPGs from the time, but there's great characters in it, the story's pretty engaging, and the different planets you can explore, they're more interesting than exploring planets in Starfield, I can tell you that. The original has a lot of fans. People love that game, they still talk about it, and that had people concerned about this remake. The first thing that was quite obvious is it was not going to be the same game at all. The original had a Dungeons & Dragons inspired battle system. It's real-time with pause, which is essentially dice rolls. That doesn't seem to go over too well with executives for the most part. So Embracer Group, who were going to be the publisher of this remake, they wanted to cast a wider net, and they decided that this was instead going to have an action-based combat system. I'm really not sure how this was going to work, because the original game, it's not really massive in scope. The areas are pretty small, they're cozy, and having that slower combat ensures you don't sort of just rush through all of the areas in 2 seconds. You've got to work your way through these encounters. That suggests to me that it was basically going to be a new game that was just using the name, the story to try and gain some traction. The actual gameplay was going to be totally different. The project was sounding like quite the endeavour, because you're automatically going to have fans skeptical when you're changing it up so much. The game's going to have to look really good, it's going to have to prove itself to get that positive word of mouth happening, and if you change up the game that much, you're just going to lose the nostalgic aspect, and it begins to just start to look like you're cashing in on the name itself. There's plenty of previous examples of this. You only have to look at the Dead Space remake, Resident Evil 4. Both of those feel new, but they're absolutely true to the original games. If you look at something like Prey by Bethesda, now Arcane, who were behind that, they didn't want to call it Prey, so leave them out of this. They're a good developer, or at least they were at the time before they made friggin' Redfall. But Bethesda forced them to call this game Prey, and it had nothing to do with the original. It pissed people off, and I think it had something to do with that game's poor sales. But Dead Space, Resident Evil 4, they had massive amounts of excitement when their remakes were shown off. It was clear that they were sticking to the original feel of those titles. Whereas with KOTOR, it just felt like they were going for that, oh, we're going to change this up for a modern audience, and we don't really care about the original fans. It kind of had that feel. This brings us to what seems like its cancellation. I mentioned Embracer Group. This is the organisation that were previously known as THQ Nordic. They were buying every IP under the sun, they were looking for scraps under the couch. Basically IPs you sort of knew at the back of your brain somewhere, but no one's really given them a second thought for 10 years. How many of you even heard of? There's Zax the Alien Hunter, there was Yoga for the Nintendo Wii. These are the sort of IPs that they were buying up, so quantity over quality. Somehow they ended up being given the green light by Lucasfilm to develop the KOTOR remake. Embracer Group, they've got a ton of studios, and one of them is Aspyr. They're the ones who are leading development. Now this studio, they're known for pretty much only porting games, not creating new ones. Not even remaking them, just literal ports. That should have set off some alarm bells for anyone who was excited about KOTOR. There was the typical hype, including a CGI trailer that had absolutely no gameplay. Then there was radio silence. There were barely any updates. anytime Embracer or Aspyr asked something about the game, it was crickets. Development was eventually moved away from Aspyr, and it was Saber Interactive Europe, I believe it's a Portugal studio. They haven't really done a lot, and now they're the ones leading this project, so the game is moving around different studios. It doesn't look good. That then leads us to today. Sony, who were going to be getting KOTOR as a timed exclusive, they were really pushing the marketing. They have now deleted the reveal trailer from their YouTube, and they look to be scrubbing all mention of the game from their side of things. Normally I'd say that's not something to jump to conclusions about, but remember that Embracer is the gaming organisation that were growing. They had a $2 billion deal with a Middle Eastern company completely fall through. And they basically went from riches to rags because of it. They were buying up everything, and now they're apparently selling and cancelling everything. They already shut down that Saints Row studio, and let's be honest, good riddance to them, but they also have shut down studios who haven't actually done anything wrong. There's a pretty niche RPG series called Expeditions, and most of the games on Steam have very positive reviews. The people behind these games, they were set up with a brand new studio by Embracer, but before they could actually finish a title, really get started, Embracer turned off the lights. They shut them down. So Embracer are basically out for blood, and it seems extremely likely that KOTOR has been the next title to get the axe. We don't know exactly why the development was moved from Aspyr to Saber, that most recent studio I mentioned, but what's probably the case is that development was not going very well. We've seen with Vampire Bloodlines 2 what happens when a dev cycle gets completely messed up. A game goes from being a realistic 3-4 year project to being an 8-year project, and there's no way to make any money off it. Perhaps Embracer just decided to cut their losses. They'd already spent a ton of cash on this game, it wasn't doing well, and given there's barely been a peep about it from their studios, maybe they thought they could just get away with quietly removing all the marketing material, and they hoped no one would notice. That being said, if you were desperately full of hopium, you could argue that Sony removed the launch trailer and they removed all marketing material because that was when it was Aspyr's project. And now that it's moved to a different development studio, maybe that's why, because they're doing a relaunch, but I mean, come on, it's too much of a coincidence that Embracer are cancelling games left, right, and centre, but this is the game that they're sticking with. I do not think that is the case. Maybe they will do something different with it. Maybe we'll get a remaster of the original, or we might get something in scope, but I think this whole remake action combat, that's not happening. And to be honest, I wouldn't be totally against a smaller scale project. I don't think there's a world where an inexperienced dev delivers a massively revamped KOTOR experience that lives up to the original anyway. If they were making a brand new game, maybe a KOTOR 3 or just a different Star Wars RPG, I'd be more inclined to give a studio the benefit of the doubt. But something like KOTOR, they're probably just going to tarnish the original. It's actually interesting timing as well, because original KOTOR actually had a battle system quite similar to the Baldur's Gate series. And Embracer decided that sort of battle system was outdated, it was not going to bring Star Wars fans to the table. Despite that, Baldur's Gate 3 came out this year and has done really well. With that in mind, should Lucasfilm take the IP away from Embracer, maybe give it to a studio like Larian? I know that Larian is showing interest in creating a smaller project after what was a massive effort with BG3, and maybe a remake by them, in the same spirit of the original, could be a nice little smaller side project for them. This would be a 20-30 hour experience rather than some huge 100 plus hour 6-year project. If KOTOR doesn't get its time in the sun, then surely there is room for a different RPG in the Star Wars universe, something original. The Star Wars Jedi series, it's been very successful, the PC port of Survivor aside. So Lucasfilm should really strike while the iron is hot and let quality developers get to work, because it is the perfect time to stand out. Disney are doing nothing positive for Star Wars, so allow these video games, allow the medium to keep thriving, because that's where things are actually working right now. It's where Star Wars actually has a positive presence. I'm going to consider this one cancelled. If Embracer are secretly rebooting it and it turns out amazing, I'm more than happy to look like an idiot. I'd love to be proved wrong, but I would not get your hopes up. Just on an on-topic side note, there's actually something else happening that's KOTOR related. Nintendo Switch players were promised that when KOTOR 2 released, at some point they were going to get the restored content mod. That actually happened ages ago, but there's been an update. But the short of that story was, KOTOR 2 was one of those Obsidian games that was rushed out the door. Some publisher said, get it out by Christmas. They did their best, but it came out in an unfinished state. The team behind the KOTOR 2 port on Switch, they promised Switch users that they would get the restored content mod, which is a pretty big deal because unlike PC, getting a mod on the Switch, I assume that you've got to hack it or something. It's probably not easy. But this studio, they were selling the game with this promise being part of it. So I imagine that there were plenty of people who bought the game for that reason. They were probably non-PC players, they'd never had a chance to try out this mod, so they bought this port with the promise that they were going to get brand new content for the game that they'd never seen before, this restored content mod. At some point, the developer decided, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to give anyone refunds. Instead, we're going to give you an old Star Wars game as compensation. Now, that is shoddy, but it probably wasn't serious enough to get everyone on the internet in a rage, so nothing really happened, it all seemed rosy. But it actually isn't, because the people who were ripped off, they've actually now taken action via a class action lawsuit. This will be pretty interesting, as it seems to me like it was false advertising. And even if they didn't add the mod because of technical or legal reasons, let's say an understandable reason, they still should have offered people refunds, not just a free game. It just seems extremely common in the gaming industry that borderline fraud occurs and it's swept under the carpet, and I have to think that it's because it involves entertainment products. If this was happening in other industries, I don't think these stunts would be considered acceptable. Even if the studio doesn't lose the lawsuit, I hope it's very expensive for them, and that way we don't see this sort of crap from other publishers, developers, because it shouldn't happen. But anyway, that's all I've got. See you next time. Bye.